Welcome to the recording of the learning environment, mobilization of staff and student wellness as part of the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit's three-part series for positive school climate. Today, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Stacie Molnar-Main join us. This is one part of a three-part series for us. Dr. Molnar-Main is a consultant with the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Office for Safe Schools. I have such a privilege to get the chance to work with her on school climate, but she's worked with PDE focusing on advancing strategies and building networks to foster positive school climate. She is a former school psychologist and counselor, and one thing you will find out very quickly is Stacie is passionate about promoting educational practices that really support teacher learning and that whole child development. She's the author of several journal articles and white papers on bully prevention, as well as the 2017 book, Deliberation in the Classroom, Fostering Critical Thinking, Community, and Citizenship in Schools. And I leave you in the great, capable hands of Dr. Stacie Molnar-Main.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. It's the end of a long day, I know, and I appreciate your dedication to coming together to talk about this topic. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is part of the Accelerated Learning Series, which is Pennsylvania Department of Education's framework for supporting schools as they consider reopening next year, and the important questions around how do we provide the academic, personal, social, and behavioral support to students as they move back into a new normal. This session is going to focus on some key terms that we think are important to that work, as well as focusing on the concept of integration. That is the theme for next year, in our opinion, and we're saying that because we've been listening to the field. We've been listening to people like you and other points of contact at the district level and at the IU level who say, yes, we know that we have a lot of important work to do in terms of bringing students and teachers and staff back into the building and moving forward with our accelerated learning framework, but we can't do it fragmented. We have so much on the table that we really need an integrated framework. So that's the real meat today, is to offer you an integrated way to look at trauma, equity, school climate, and SEL, and how those impact the learning environment, so that you can take what makes sense to you as you go back into the LEAs and begin to move forward in a deliberate methodological way, systematic way, to building out action plans and supporting schools in doing this important work. So we will end with a review of some resources and strategies for improving the learning environment and mobilizing for student staff wellness as we move forward into next year, specifically as it relates to supportive learning environments. And some of the concepts that we often hear people talk about when we're talking about supportive learning environments are things like school climate. We'll hear folks talk about what is the climate of your school and how does that affect student learning, because we know that there's a real connection between how students perceive the school climate and how they perform. There's a lot of talk about equity, and this was important before we started to deal with the trauma of racial violence that we've been faced with over the last few years. But it's taken a new meaning over this pandemic as our students have been faced with, and faculty have been faced with a lot of examples of racial violence, and they haven't had spaces to come together to process them. We also know that the work that we do around equity is absolutely about accessing the curriculum and making sure that every student has the opportunity to learn and succeed. Trauma-informed practices is important as we move into next year. We sometimes frame those under the universal wellness practices umbrella. Social emotional learning, we hear people talk about, and in PA we sometimes refer to career ready skills, and we use that interchangeably with social emotional learning. So what is the learning environment? This is a phrase that we're introducing, and we want folks to be using this at our IU levels as we're moving forward with providing social and academic supports. It's more than school climate. It really is the facilities, the classrooms, the school-based health supports, and the disciplinary policies and practices that set the tone for learning in a school or in a classroom. And as we've learned over the last year, the concept of learning environment is not just a physical environment, it also can apply to face-to-face and online education. And so our districts are going to have the opportunity to make decisions at the local level about how they organize instruction next year. And it's possible that you will have some districts that are, or you may work in a district that is going to continue to provide online learning opportunities for students who may not feel comfortable coming back to the building next year. And so it's important to think about what types of learning environments those young people have, as well as the live face-to-face learning environments. School climate is different from the learning environment because it pertains to how the learning environment is perceived. When folks ask me, well, why is it important to measure school climate or to think about school climate? Well, oftentimes we're implementing practices that our data says are really effective, and yet students may not perceive what we want them to perceive, right? We want them to feel welcome. We want them to feel included. Well, that may not show up on disciplinary data, right? Or some of the data sets that we regularly use. So school climate really taps into student and adults' perceptions of the learning environment, and it really taps into the quality and character of school life. Those patterns of students, parents, and school staff's experiences of school, and those norms, goals, values, and interpersonal relationships that are that they experience when they're there. A positive and equitable school climate supports the development and learning of all students. So if we are talking about school climate and not all students are perceiving their school climate as safe, welcoming, supportive, then we don't have an equitable school climate, particularly if subgroups of students can be identified as having a very different experience. So when we talk about the learning environment, how do we begin to approach this big amorphous concept? Using the National Center for Safe and Supportive Learning's framework, Pennsylvania has adopted sort of a three-element way of defining learning environments. That is safety for all students feel safe and secure, all students experience support and engagement, and student support is directly related to their engagement in the curriculum, their engagement in relationships within the building. And so we bring those two together under one umbrella. And then finally, an equitable environment. We drill down a little further, and again, this is a framework that you can use as you're thinking about moving into organizing work next year. If you decide to focus your efforts on support and engagement, and that would not be a bad idea given the fact that in many places students have been very disconnected and isolated over the last year. Many have experienced learning loss, and so it'll be critical that they come in engaged and ready to perform, or at least engaged and safe, so that we can begin to introduce our accelerated platforms to them. We're talking about the quality of relationships. We're talking about making sure our staff is culturally competent and really prepared to engage with all learners. We're talking about prioritizing school participation. What opportunities exist for students to become involved in the life of the school outside of the classroom? Because, if we have young people who are feeling isolated, walking into a classroom that's moving ahead with the math curriculum is not going to potentially give them the community that they might need to reconnect to the school. So what other ways can we invite students to participate in the life of the school and the classroom? When we talk about safety, we're talking about emotional and physical safety. We're still going to be focused on paying attention to bullying and cyberbullying prevention. There may have been some behaviors or patterns that have developed while kids were away and online more frequently that we should be with it on. That is, we should learn about and be prepared to educate, not just intervene, but educate too. We're talking about substance use and our SAP programs, and are they still functioning? And how can we use that group to help to leverage safety and support in our buildings, and of course our emergency plans. When we're focusing on equity, and some districts actually have an explicit focus on equity right now, it's about equitable access to the physical environment, the academic environment, physical and mental wellness, and an equitable disciplinary environment. So again, we could probably open up the floor and really talk about what each of these components means and how it shows up in your school buildings. But I present this to you because as your districts are moving forward in a systematic way, the interrelationship between these different elements of the learning environment are important, but we can also isolate them and really focus on strategies in each of these areas. So Pennsylvania has a specific definition of equity that we use, and that is equity is every student having access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, family background, and or family income. It's different than giving everyone the same thing. It is actually identifying what students need and giving them what they need to succeed. There are a number of resources that schools can use to prioritize equity next year. The Mid-Atlantic Equity Center, Learning for Justice, which used to be called Teaching Tolerance. Many of you may be familiar with that organization. Pennsylvania has an Equitable Practices Hub that has tons and tons of ideas, resources that are there and ready to go. And the Equity and Inclusion Toolkit is really more specific to our planning around equity and inclusion than what I would say are all our tier one interventions. The definition of trauma that's used in Pennsylvania is actually defined in Act 18 of 2019, and it's defined this way. Exposure to an event or series of events that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. It has lasting adverse effects, and it creates difficulty in cognitive functioning and physical, social, emotional, mental, or spiritual well-being. So what's important here is there's three elements that are required. There needs to be exposure to a traumatic event, and then there needs to be evidence of lasting effects. So not every child will experience a traumatic event and have lasting effects. And in that case, you would not say that that child is impacted by trauma. They really need to have that exposure, have lasting effects, and then have some significant difficulty in functioning in one of these areas. Because we don't know who has been impacted by trauma or who will be impacted by trauma, even though we know that many of our students will have experienced traumatic events, it's important to move forward in our work in our accelerated learning environment with these 5 principles of trauma-informed care in mind. That is a commitment to practices that promote safety, a commitment to practices that promote trustworthiness, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, choice and voice, and cultural sensitivity. So I share this with you because, again, here is a framework that is easily integrated into many things that we do, whether it be our PBIS work, whether it be even how we organize faculty meetings, or our own relationships with our own colleagues. How can we engage in ways that promote trustworthiness? How do we promote collaboration and mutual engagement, empowerment, choice and voice, and cultural sensitivity? You can go forth next year and if you plan with these principles in mind, whether it's comprehensive planning, whether it's planning around math instruction, you will be doing trauma-informed care if you really put an emphasis on these 5 core values. So when we talk about the integration of the learning environment with equity, and trauma-informed practices, we think about them as like cogs in a wheel, right? We focus on that environment, safety for all, support and engagement, equity. And then we bring together our trauma-informed values, which lead to a more equitable trauma-informed learning environment. So it's as if we can't do one without the other. Does this make sense to you?
Stacie, I have a quick question. It was sent to me privately. Can you talk about what safety means, not just in terms of physical safety? And you talk about the emotional safety and maybe some things for us to think about when working with staff who work with students.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about safety, we talk about physical safety, we talk about emotional safety, and we talk about academic safety. Okay, academic safety is having enough, not being asked to do more than you're able to, enough challenge, but not more than what you would be able to do, and also not embarrassing students in the class, creating safe activities, right? Where students would not be too vulnerable in front of their peers. The same issues are important to keep in mind when we're working with faculty. Many people have had a whole range of experiences over the last year and a half. We've all collectively experienced the trauma of a pandemic. Many folks have lost loved ones or have been impacted by the anxiety of maybe being concerned about family members or others. The political context in which we've been living has been very charged. So safety for the adults in the building really is to reestablish norms of trust, reestablish norms of mutual respect and care, reestablishing ways that we care about what you have to say, we care about your input into decisions that affect your classroom, right? And creating opportunities for staff to have a voice together, as well as being sensitive to the charged environment around racial justice right now. So I think that we need to actually create those spaces, make folks open up the conversation. What districts and schools should be planning for right now as we're ending this school year and before we move into next year and over the summer is those universal wellness practices. By having intentionally planned school-wide and classroom activities that are designed to foster positive social, emotional, and behavioral skills and the well-being of all staff and students, regardless of whether we think they're at risk of mental health problems. So these are proactive strategies that are designed to prioritize relationships, self-care, and support. So how do you approach staff wellness in the learning environment using this equitable trauma-informed approach? Well, you do need to develop a plan. We can't leave it to chance. We need to plan to address staff well-being through ongoing professional learning opportunities. And we need to integrate a continuum of wellness practices that are equitable in scope. So how are we going to model and support wellness practices of our staff in the context of the school? And that's an important question that teams could really bite into this year before they leave for the summer. There really should be a continuum that's promoted as well as a plan going forward. Here are some examples at the bottom of resources. When I share this PowerPoint, you should be able to access those by just clicking on the various links. It's also important because we know that everyone's, doesn't want another thing on their plate, that we align staff well-being improvement efforts within the learning environment, right? So we want to use any assessment data that we have to inform our planning, as well as move forward with those trauma-informed values in mind. We want to develop predictable school-wide routines for our students as well as our staff. We want to set those school-wide expectations of positive behavior, provide interactive professional development opportunities, and I'm not providing a great model today, because Zoom is such a difficult platform, though I think the bigger issue is that we're being recorded for posterity, and it's never fun to watch the interaction that you can't participate in. But that interactive professional development is really critical because it gives an opportunity for voice, choice, and mutual engagement. And then we need to develop skill sets to manage expectations, set boundaries, build relationships, and practice ongoing self-care. So in my experience, educators have a lot on their plate most of the time. And while they may intend to engage in self-care and focus on building relationships with their peers, sometimes there's not enough time in the day. So that's why it's going to be really important as we move into next year is that we do help to establish boundaries, help teachers establish those, set time aside to build relationships, and actually establish the expectation of self-care and actually provide examples of that, or even host it in the building. And that could be a great opportunity for community building as well. The resources that support staff well-being should be available right there in the learning environment. So as I mentioned, how are we going to model and make self-care activities available in the school? How do we integrate those activities into the daily school culture? We need to teach our staff, again, it begins with professional development, the benefits of a wellness mindset that's focused, again, not just on the physical, but also the mental and emotional. And the utilization of stress reduction strategies as an integrated part of our learning environment. Again, a number of resources are listed here. Every school LEA needs to decide what their approach is going to be. There are some toolkits that can be used that'll provide you a number of activities and resources that are easy to integrate. But for the most part, you're going to need to develop your own plans. Some resources that to support staff and student social emotional wellness that were not referenced before are listed here. Making these types of resources available that are really tier 2 or tier 3 resources for our faculty and students is going to be very important. Now, we talked about all of this involves the integration of cultural responsiveness into the fabric of the school, like those cogs on the wheel that I talked about. We're talking about an equitable trauma-informed learning environment. We need to be on that journey toward cultural responsiveness and recognize that it is not easy work and that it's ongoing work and that we need to make ourselves vulnerable. And given the fact that we are all feeling exhausted and maybe a little more vulnerable than we would like, doing this work with consistency and care is going to be important. And I like this framework that's been offered that's called the will, the fill, and the skill. So if we're going to do cultural competence work, we need the will or the desire to lead with a commitment to achieving equitable outcomes. We need to want to do the work. We need to do that self-knowledge and that reflective work where we really are working on self-awareness and awareness of others. Just this is where you pour the vessel in, right? You open your ears and you're willing to listen. That you reflect on your own identity and your own path to where you are and how that relates to the opportunities and access that you have had throughout your life. And then there is the skill. That is actually learning the skills of engaging with these ideas and learning the skills of cultural humility that is necessary to engage across different cultural contexts.
Stacie, this whole idea of the skill, that's really going to be challenged. I just recently got off of a phone call with a principal in our county that said that he really needs to start thinking about what skills his students will need. And I even think about myself when I first started going back to work. There were different skills that I had not used in a long time. because of the pandemic. So I think that what you're saying about the skill is really important because it's not necessarily a skill we don't know, but maybe a skill is rusty.
Yes, yes. Yeah, if I could wave my magic wand, and I'm not speaking on for PDE when I say this, I'm saying this as a person. If I could wave my magic wand and I could create a school schedule for next year, I would have as much staff development, teaming time as I could, at least that I could squeeze out for a year that would be extra, just so that we have space to do this work and get back to work in a way that acknowledges, that we might be a little rusty, we might be changed, and the work might be harder now simply because we've gone through what we've gone through over the last year. To break it down a little more, again, I'm giving you frameworks that are designed to complement one another and fit together. It's not that you have to do everything that I've outlined here, but I am trying to provide you with different ways of thinking about change and about the work of accelerating learning for positive learning environments as you go back to school. And if we're just at the will stage, that we're just developing that commitment to doing the equity work, what do we need to do? We need to become aware, and we need to examine the system's impact on our families and students by looking at data, right? Once we have developed that awareness of the problem and the need, that can motivate our will to lead. And then we need to move in gaining that cultural knowledge. And that is, becoming to believe that all students can learn, taking time to understand our own unique identity and worldview, and those of the community and our students, and then applying knowledge in leading and advocating for equity practices, addressing institutional barriers to access for all students, and adopting curriculum and practices that respect all students' cultures. And I know, this is big work, so I'm not giving you a roadmap here. Go to the Equitable Practices Hub in a much deeper way. We talk about the ecological systems model. I just throw this in here so that you know that the work that you're doing really is in that system that we might call the microsystem, which is right around the outside of our youth. But you are also impacted by all of those other factors. That is the media, your neighbors, your services, and society at large. So the stronger that you can be as a faculty in your relationships and in your trauma-informed values, adopting those and trying to move those forward, the more that you're going to be able to provide a system of support around students that can begin to help insulate or mediate between some of the other stressors that they may experience in their lives. So how do we advance student wellness practices at the universal level? Well, we first address staff wellness needs. So we just spent some time on that, right? We want to prioritize school climate. That is, what do our students say they experience in our school, right? We want to look at other types of data as well. It's not just those climate surveys. We want to look at our behavioral data, our attendance data, equitable outcomes data, right? We want to establish those clear expectations and predictable routines. So if we have a PBIS team or other teams that are in place, they really are a key piece of this universal strategies component. Again, focusing on relationships and supports, focusing on reducing exclusionary disciplinary practices, increasing mental health literacy, increasing social emotional learning, especially self-regulation skills, and providing opportunities for students to explore individual and community identities. So again, if you were saying, okay, what are we going to do at the universal level around wellness practices next year, you could look at this and say, first I need a team, right? We need to get ready. We need to work on a plan. But here's some different areas of practice at the universal level that we may focus on. And here are some links to universal strategy resources that you'll be able to follow through with when you receive the PowerPoint. Obviously, there's many more, but we tried to curate them to the ones that we feel like would be the most efficient and effective if given our limited amount of time in terms of getting ready for next year. So I've talked about SEL a few times, and it's probably a term that you're familiar with right now. Castle defines it as the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. There is a great meta-analysis that has shown that SEL supports academic learning in a big way. Serious increases are seen in academic achievement outcomes when schools are implementing SEL systematically. So the key word is systematically. So as you're planning for next year, systematically means looking at data, deciding what the need is, identifying those clear strategies, right? Implementing them with fidelity, and then taking a look and monitoring and adapting as you go to make sure that you're being as effective and efficient as you can in delivering. And again, our PBIS folks, this will not be unfamiliar to you, which is why, you know, our existing teams that are already doing our universal work are the ones that can be brought forward and leveraged for this important learning environments work. The PA Career Ready skills are Pennsylvania's homegrown SEL skills. You know, several years ago, the department had a work group that was identifying personal and interpersonal skills standards, and that work became the Pennsylvania Career Ready skills. There was some concern about adopting these standards would feel like just one more thing, and yet when we heard from folks in the field, particularly employers and others, they said, actually, SEL skills are the most important thing that many of our students bring, or our new employees bring to the table. Can we please keep this work alive, but can we put it under the career skills umbrella? So if you're not familiar with the PA Career Ready skills, they're very succinct and organized, and are a version of social emotional learning skills, but really in preparation for the workforce. There's a toolkit available on the PA Department of Education website that you can access through this link on this page.
And Stacie, can I say that the new curriculum framework and the ICANN series in the appendix, we have found that so helpful. So if you're on the call and you haven't seen the ICANN appendix, great place to look.
Great, great. Very practical. I mean, I know that the person at PD who was working on that, she had a team from across the U.S. that was helping to develop how we might roll this out, and was in part of a learning community. So she'll be glad to hear that. The goal is to make it as practical as possible. So how do you sustain these practices? I mean, we don't want to move into next year putting a lot of effort into practices to build a safe, equitable, supportive learning environment, and put this effort forth and not have it sustain beyond this year. So what we want you to be doing is building up building a plane that is going to continue to fly and take you to new places beyond next year, but you're going to be building it based upon the current needs of your students and what you expect your students and faculty will need to succeed next year. So you want to make sure that the universal practices you select fit the unique strengths, needs, and cultural linguistic considerations of students and families in your school. So how do you do that? You really should have a team that is a selection committee and making sure that the committee has diverse enough representation that you know it's going to fit. It's going to work with your pedagogical practices. It's going to work with your community characteristics, that your staff, it's going to be the type of strategies that your staff, most of your staff can buy into. You want to look at your student body. Was the intervention that you're selecting or the strategies you're selecting, are they appropriate to the identities of your kids? You might want to consider pilot testing new practices in the first couple weeks of school. and then coming back together and saying, how's it going? And then adapt the practice to fit, to be more appropriate, more impactful based upon that 2 to 4 week pilot. You also want to make sure that you're providing adequate resources and professional development. And we say prioritizing cultural competence because we do see this as a critical area of work for schools going into next year and beyond. And then finally, the issue of fidelity of implementation over time is always an important consideration. And I want to just, be real. I spent a lot of time working at the school level. Oftentimes when new practices, universal practices are brought forth, we're sort of waiting for them to go away. We're not totally committed to them when we begin them, which is why it's really important that we do that pilot phase and that we monitor fidelity at the beginning so that we can see where implementation is happening and isn't, and when it isn't happening, understand why, and work with the faculty that are not implementing to try and get on board. And if it's not being implemented because it doesn't fit their student body, that doesn't fit how they approach their learning, that's important learning to take back. But we cannot abandon this commitment to the learning environments and universal wellness practices because it's going to be a significant need at the beginning of next year and beyond, and it's going to pay dividends in the end. So this is going to be a beginning that we don't see the end of. This is something we want to sustain into the years after this year. So for information on evidence-based practices, these are our links. If you want to approach the work using a program-based model, these are the resources that you would go to. PA Evidence Resource Center is Pennsylvania's own homegrown What Works clearinghouse. So I want you to leave this presentation knowing that you at the school level can work to create this equitable trauma-informed environment by advancing and sustaining universal wellness practices that fit the unique characteristics and needs of your students in your school. Now, I provided lots of sort of organizing frameworks that you can use, but I do believe that at the local level, you know your communities, and you should be empowered with your teams at your local schools to take this information and make sense of it, keeping in mind that the elements of equity, equitable environments, safety, and support are really critical to all plans. So just another important caveat, and you can certainly take time to read this, but I want you to think about this very seriously. How we work is the work going into next year. So when we talked about those trauma-informed values, those all relate to how we work. And we do not want to give short shrift to trying to do this work with sensitivity and care and with the engagement of our faculty and our students.
How do we balance that some kids did okay? Like maybe there's not like the learning loss, or I know we don't want to say that, but there's not some of that socially, emotionally, maybe they've come out really well, like maybe this was something their families and they needed and they're fine. So how do we balance that? Because I don't want to see kids who were okay all of a sudden get stressed out because we're talking so much of this stuff. I don't know if you catch my drift where I'm going.
I totally hear you, Carrie. And it sort of gets back to that definition of trauma, trauma and the trauma-informed definition that we use. You have to have experienced a traumatic event. You also need to be demonstrating lasting impacts, right? And it has to affect your functioning. And what happens if kids went through this traumatic event? There's going to be a huge percentage of your kids that went through and are not traumatized, quote unquote, right? But what I think is, and so that's why I think it's important that when you implement your SEL work, when you implement your trauma-informed core values, that they don't feel like they're a reaction to the pandemic. We're not processing the pandemic, right? We're just approaching the way we do instruction with a slightly different tweak, right? We're just paying a little more attention to relationships and making everyone feel connected. We're paying a little more attention to making sure that we're paying attention to knowing, trying to figure out who might need support, right? But we're not assuming that everyone needs extra support. But we are implementing a little more focus on trauma-informed practice and SEL at the beginning of the year because we don't know who's going to be impacted, right?
Right.
But it is a lot in the framing.
Right.
So we need to make sure that it feels authentic and it's grounded in that relationship with the teacher and with focused on building a classroom community that's supportive. And that should always be our goal. But right now we've got this great opportunity to like embrace this and do it well. And yeah, I think you're totally right, Carrie. Make sure that they don't feel like we're forcing them all into therapy. And I would say that, you know, you could frame that with a good inquiry question. How do we center social emotional learning and support for all students that we've always wanted to do and make it feel authentic coming out of the pandemic? I don't know. There's a lot of different ways that you could frame it as an inquiry question and then allow staff to really grapple with it. Because I think if we just tell them, you know, here again is another opportunity to apply those trauma-informed values, right? How do we do this in a collaborative way, a mutual way, deal with this challenge that you just named? We probably need to invite our faculty into conversation about that so that they can say, in my math class, I did this. Maybe I'm going to do it this way now because it's going to be how I do things this year, next year, and 5 years from now. It's not about the pandemic. It's about how we've been changed or how we've decided to change to meet all kids' needs and just be more aware of this area of practice that has always been important.
We have a chance here now to get back to family, to get back to relationships, to get back to what's really important and to reestablish that type of thing.
Stacie, very much appreciate your time tonight. I know it's getting into the dinner hour, and I know that you volunteered to do this for us. We so appreciate everything that you shared.
It was a pleasure to be here. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Everyone.